I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Hellbent for Horror. Did you miss me? I certainly missed you. And we are recording today on the 29th of August, and this would have been William Friedkin's 88th birthday. Unfortunately, he did die August 7th of this year from complications of pneumonia. And I want to do a show here that's going to be a little bit more stream of conscious than I usually do. I hope that doesn't come off terribly. But there's something about spending the last several weeks immersed in William Friedkin and trying to figure out what it is that has always transfixed me and fascinated me about him and given me this strange love-hate relationship with an artist that I've had with William Friedkin. And I think that many people who are horror lovers have with William Friedkin. Someone who equally created perhaps one of the most iconic horror films ever, allowed people who are not horror fans to begrudgingly see one and say that they were believers, but also the same guy who said it's not a horror movie and kind of rat-fucked some of us horror fans for several years by saying some outrageous claims, which I believe at the moment he believed. I also believe later on in his life when he said that it was a horror film, that he believed that. I don't think William Friedkin was a liar. I think William Friedkin essentially believed everything that he was saying when it was coming out of his mouth. He was a true believer in that. He lived life right then and there. And I think in that way, I kind of feel, I don't know, a little bit like a documentary filmmaker today. I feel like going back to his roots with that idea of the one take and the idea of the shaky camera. And I'm kind of known for spending a lot of time working on my pieces, and I don't know why. I just kind of feel like talking off the cuff about William Friedkin and the obsessiveness around me, around an obsessive person who made films for over 50 years. So it's interesting that William Friedkin dies right before the 50th anniversary of the film that horror fans know him the most for, which is The Exorcist. Believe it or not, The Exorcist came out on December 26th, 1973. It was not a Halloween film, and the reason for that was that Warner Brothers was actually very nervous about putting out this movie anywhere around the Christmas season. So the idea of having it after the birthday of Christ seemed as if it was going to be okay, as opposed to having it in the theaters a few weeks before that. So we miss having William Friedkin there for the 50th birthday of The Exorcist live. We also miss who knows what kind of shitstorm it was going to be when David Gordon Green's new sequel of The Exorcist came out. I don't know enough about what Friedkin thought of that. So I'm calling him William Friedkin, but the reality is if you ever go into any kind of documentary about Friedkin's work or any interviews that are there on YouTube or even in print, you usually hear him referred to as Billy. And that's a very interesting thing because William Friedkin was a controversial character in many ways. He was someone who came from an old school of filmmaking where directors laid hands on actors at times. He was known for slapping a few actors. He was known for deceiving a few actors. He was known for shooting off fake guns and smashing things just to get responses from the actors. He was also someone who would not take no for an answer. He was thoroughly obsessed from the very beginning. In his readings of his book, The Friedkin Connection, he tells you flat out that he never even thought of safety when he was dealing with things like the chase scene in The French Connection, which notoriously on a Sunday for 23 blocks, he drove at 90 miles an hour through New York City and did it without any permits. It wasn't as if he was worried about that. He didn't think of it at all. So this is a mindset of obsessiveness that is equally fascinating and probably equally repugnant for some folks. He's not the first guy to do this, of course. He is from an old school of people who used to do this. You had Alfred Hitchcock, Otto Preminger, Sam Peckinpah. The list goes on of people who were difficult with actors, people who were perfectionists in a way that they made everyone very nervous. They're dictatorial on the set. He's far from the first one. But there's an interesting thing that you see when you take a closer look at interviews that there are about these directors. When Janet Leigh talked about Alfred Hitchcock, she called him Mr. Hitchcock. People would talk about Mr. Preminger. They would talk about Mr. Ford. They would talk about Mr. Hawks, Mr. Stevens, but they would not call them Alfie, right? You're not going to get Alfie Hitchcock. There was a level of respect that was there, but in the underpinning of calling someone Mr., there's a formality that allows for emotional distance. But the interesting thing is, you have people like Linda Blair, you have people like Ellen Burstyn, people who were injured at certain points in his films, people who would say, I don't feel good about this, and then have him double down on what they didn't feel good about and push them and bring them to tears. He could do all of that, but Ellen Burstyn would always call him Billy. And the same thing with Linda Blair, Billy. People who he yelled at and slapped in films would call him Billy in interviews. So it's an interesting thing. You have this man who could, from the outside, be seen as a devilish person, also garner a certain precociousness, a playfulness, something about what he was doing. And yes, perhaps you can look at it as, well, they all got great careers out of this. I'd probably be really nice to him too. Maybe that's true, but there's something about how people talk about working with him, almost as if it's hard to believe that they went through what they went through. There's something there that was entertaining about Billy. Call me Billy, right? When I hear Call Me Billy, I think of Creepshow, Adrienne Barbeau's character, who's the shrewish wife of Hal Holbrook in one of the Creepshow episodes, George Romero's film, and the other famous Billy outside of Billy Friedkin and Adrienne Barbeau's Billy is Billy from Black Christmas, the murderer. So, it's interesting where my brain goes on this. But there's something there. There's something there behind the fascination that there is with William Friedkin. And I will say that my fascination goes all the way back to being a child, and why I think that this death is affecting me probably as much as the death of George Romero did, or the death of Tobe Hooper did. There's something about complex people, strange people, difficult people, but also people who are just astonishing at what they do. And so, one of the reasons that I think that William Friedkin matters so much to me, or continues to matter so much to me, is because of when he hits. To be quite honest, when I was growing up, The Godfather was in the theater, The Exorcist was in the theater. I was old enough to be aware of them. I was not old enough to see them, but I was old enough to hear the legend and lore about them. And this is kind of important in the love of Friedkin and other filmmakers. I grew up at a time that was considered the golden era of cinema in America. It's known as the New Hollywood. Of course, the New Hollywood, most of them are dying from old age at this point, but the New Hollywood was a complete break from the studio system that was going before it. It was a complete break in what kind of films they felt that the American people wanted to see, and it was a break into a European style of filmmaking, which allowed for more reality, more grit, and more questioning of authority. And so I grew up in this time when I heard even people like my dad, not exactly someone who you would think would read Cahiers du Cinema. He's not going to call Andrew Sarris a god, but he did understand that something interesting was happening in the world of entertainment. My dad, like many people, loved films, loved being entertained. And he was more than a casual fan, although as time went by, he became more of just a regular everyday viewer. But he was the person who let me know that there was such a thing as directors, and that was with Alfred Hitchcock. He mentioned to me what Alfred Hitchcock did in the way of films, and that he was a director. He was the guy that told people what to do, right? Anyway, with all of that said, growing up at that time, hearing what was happening in New Hollywood, seeing people get excited about film and reading about this. This was a time when people believed in critics. They believed in film. They thought that perhaps film could change the world. There was this feeling that film spoke about more than just car chases. And yet the best films still had car chases, still worked in that. They worked in genre. And a lot of what we talk about when we say things like auteur theory, people want to talk about this being the sole person in charge and try to make it an ivory tower thing. The reality is that many of the people who were part of the auteur theory were people who made films that were mainstream. They made films that were genre. They took genre out of the pigeonholes that they were in and did their own form of elevation with that. And so these movies were popular. The Godfather was popular. The Exorcist was popular. French Connection was popular. These were movies that had a sensation to them, but they were also made with a certain vision. And so, in that time period, I'm growing up hearing that movies can change the world, and that directors are doing amazing things, and that risk is worth the reward that can possibly happen. All this stuff is being said, and I'm going, wow, movies matter. Car chase movies can be great. People are seeing all sorts of stuff in these movies. And so I was the same with horror. I said, why can't horror be that way? So when The Exorcist was up for Best Picture, I was like, here we go. And then Jaws after that. Here we go. We're on our way. Movies that I love can be important. They can matter. They're not just quote-unquote greasy kid stuff. There was something there that was what I believed film could be. These movies spoke to me. Horror movies spoke to me in a way that mattered more than just entertainment, and all of a sudden it seemed as if that meant something to the establishment as well. The Exorcist is up for Best Picture. And then, of course, as time went by, not only did The Exorcist not win, but then I started to hear that William Friedkin refused to call it a horror film. And that was a bit of a rat fucking for horror fans like myself who really felt that movies mattered. If movies matter, then movies matter, not certain genres of film matter, or this matters more. Film of any sort can transcend its boundaries. And so I had a difficult relationship with Billy Friedkin, as he's longed to be called. It's interesting. I mentioned that William Friedkin died on August 7th. Today is August 29th, which would have been his 88th birthday. Why is that significant? Well, the thing about Billy Friedkin is that he was quite mercurial, if we can say that. The way that he spoke about himself and about his movies kind of changed with time. He was also big on ballyhoo. He had no problems in creating a spectacle to get his films noticed and get himself noticed. And there's been spectacle and conversation and controversy from the very beginning of his films all the way back to the documentary The People versus Paul Crump. But why is the 88th birthday important? Well, I'll just go to Nat Segaloff, who is a biographer. He did a book called Hurricane Billy, all about William Friedkin, and he essentially says that William Friedkin was born in 1935. Now, how does he know that, and why is that significant? Well, to do research on Hurricane Billy, Nat pulled the birth certificate and found out that he wasn't born in 1938, which was what he normally said, what Friedkin had normally said, and it was actually 1935. And the significance of that is because when he won Best Director for The French Connection, he was called the youngest director ever to win the Oscar for directing. So, of course, Nat goes to him and says this, and says, I found this information. And, he says that Friedkin was rather dismissive about it. But the result of that was that every record had to be changed back. And so even in something like that, even in his death, there's still things that get known. And from the very beginning and from the smallest detail, you only know what Billy wants you to know. When he died, one of the things that I thought was great was a quote that was said. Many people were talking about Billy, and my favorite quote came from Terrell Lee Langford. Now, Terrell Lee is a writer and producer, probably best known now for the Bosch TV series, but he also did movies like Vice Academy 5 and 6, and I think he did a great big rewrite for Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers. Anyway, Terrell Lee had the best line about the passing of William Friedkin. I quote, "If Billy is dead, it must have been his own decision. He didn't take orders from anybody." But amidst all of the bluster and reputation that William Friedkin had, there was enough that was really exciting to me. And there was a strange generosity at times in his interviews for directors, say, I didn't know, like Joe Carnahan, that made me look out towards those people's work. There was something about him that did bring this endless fascination for me, and I have been totally fascinated and obsessed with William Friedkin's work since I learned about him. And it would get to a point where in the mid-90s, when it didn't seem like he could really get a job directing, he was on, I think, CSI, and I searched out that episode, waiting to see if the Friedkin magic would show up on there. It didn't. It was just another procedural. He was doing the job he was asked, which is being a TV director, which he had done millions of times before. But there were things like Blue Chips with Nick Nolte, where I was going, this might be it. This might get him over the top again. People will again be speaking about William Friedkin. I cared. And I think part of it is because he embodied something that was kind of important to me, which was the cinema of the 70s. This idea of 70s films being so radically different and strange, and in the tastes of how my mind worked. Now, there's plenty of filmmakers that were part of New Hollywood. There were younger directors than Friedkin who were part of New Hollywood. There were people like Francis Ford Coppola. There was Arthur Penn. There were many people who their work helped shape what was going on. But I don't know why, but I think that William Friedkin was kind of the epitome of that style. He was the style of that time. His films seemed to always have this stylistic radiation of something that was happening in the 70s. Sure, he didn't invent any of the things that I'm about to say. These things happened in films that happened earlier. But in some strange way, William Friedkin legitimized some of the more cynical things that were in films, some of the more experimental things that were in films, such as doing films in a documentary style, having the camera no longer on sticks, was something that wasn't done in cinema that was American. It was happening in foreign films, but it wasn't happening in American cinema. These things that happened, he did not originate, but he brought them into the mainstream. He brought them into a police procedural called The French Connection, which is basically happening at the same time that Adam 12 is on television. It's a sea change. And he does it in a way that he brings people who are pro-police and anti-police to the movie theater to watch this story of a morally ambiguous cop who's very much like the real cops that are out there. And instead of people pillaring him and setting fire to the film, they instead celebrate it and keep going to see it. See, there's something to be said about, yes, Arthur Penn gives us on-screen violence in a different way in Bonnie and Clyde, and Sam Peckinpah does it in The Wild Bunch, but not everybody went to see Bonnie and Clyde. Not everybody was enthralled with the idea that was behind that film. There was fathers that did not go to see a modern Western where people are like spilling their intestines on the ground. That wasn't what was selling that well. What did sell was this really interesting mainstream story told in a offbeat way. And in this way of drawing people in this genre style, he allowed this artistic, artful, strange, experimental kind of filmmaking going on that wasn't there before. It opens up the possibilities that happen with film. And I think that that is something that he did. I think that there are visual images that are repeated often in Friedkin films. The idea of dark sunglasses, mirrored sunglasses hiding people's eyes. Yes, dark mirrored sunglasses as authority or danger. Stuart Rosenblum did it first with Cool Hand Luke, but I think it became kind of a strange trademark and felt very much of its time. How many of the characters that are in Friedkin films have these dark sunglasses and there's a sense of menace about them? And I think over anything else that there is in Friedkin films, and there are several things that I think you will find in almost all of the ones that I've watched and all the great ones, is a sense of menace. Even comedies that he's done, like Deal of the Century with Chevy Chase and Sigourney Weaver, there is inside of the dread that's in there, the satire that's in there, the farce that's inside of Deal of the Century. There is a sense of menace. There's menace to what's happening with these characters. There's also a lot of bloodshed for a comedy. There's quite a few nasty blood squibs that happen inside of that film. But I think that sense of the world is dangerous, that you need to keep your head on a swivel, is inside of his films. That what seems as if it's safe is not really safe. The things that you think are institutional imperatives are not. Things that you think are immutable are not immutable. And I think we see that again and again in his films. And so to me, that is something that is very much 70s. And the people who really promoted that tended to not get a lot of work in the 80s. They were stuck in that time, it seems. And Friedkin did quite a few things to make sure that it was not easy for him to get work. And we can get to that. But I did want to bring up one of the reasons that I think that Friedkin was so important to me is that he spoke of I don't want to say honesty because it's film, right? But an authenticity that wasn't necessarily in films all the time. And that authenticity felt like people that I knew. It felt like places that I had visited. I was someone of the East Coast, but I was not New York City. I was in Pennsylvania. I was in a coal mining area of Pennsylvania. But people talked like they thought they were from Brooklyn. And so there was a feeling of a New York that I kind of knew whenever we would visit and how my parents would talk about New York. It wasn't the honeymooners New York. This was a tough and gritty place. And I think that when he brings horror to the forefront as well with The Exorcist, he once again brings a believability which gets talked about a lot. It's also really interesting to me about William Friedkin that even though he's part of the new Hollywood, that I think he was one of the great voices of that and one of the people who propelled things forward. He was not a film school guy. A lot of the things that happen in new Hollywood are happening from people who had gone to film school, university in some way. And Friedkin was one of those folks who almost didn't finish high school, and he ended up getting a job in television. He did that through the mail room in Chicago, and he worked his way up piece by piece, getting buffeted by every TV director that there was, learning a hard-knuckled kind of style. And people like him, people like Sidney Lumet, people like John Schlesinger, I believe, but John Frankenheimer, being one of the big stars of television at the time. These guys cut their teeth in an older medium, doing it live, having to come up with ideas quickly, and then taking that into cinema itself. So even though a lot of times the new Hollywood gets talked about in the way of people who went to film school, there is a whole contingency of it that comes from a more standard, mainstream, traditional fashion, and breaking from that tradition when they finally get a chance to make their own film. A little more about that sense of menace. I think it's something, and I have mentioned this before on my show, that when you're a child, I think you see cinema differently than you do as an adult. You feel the image more. The words can make sense to you, but not necessarily is it possible for you to understand nuance when someone's joking, unless it's very obvious. And I think that camera motions can affect you more. And I think that you can feel the emotion a little bit more that may be being projected. And there was a sense of menace when I first saw The French Connection, a menace that may have been seen as bracingly refreshing or somewhat intimidating to adults when they're watching Popeye Doyle doing the shakedown inside of a bar. But for a child, there were some very frightening moments in that. And it also is the beginning of something that was a trend for a while in William Friedkin films. It was this strange effect of like shooting a large, I don't know, a millipore or something, of fake blood into the face of someone who's being shot in the head, so that you just see this huge splat, and then there's a quick cut. But there's one of those in the very beginning of The French Connection, which terrified me as a child, and takes it outside of just being a normal police procedural into something that is terribly unsettling. And the very end, that ambiguous end to The French Connection, where they're inside this abandoned building and they're trying to find Frog One, and he's getting away, and a fellow police officer is killed by Popeye Doyle, and there may be reason that it was beneficial that that person dies for Popeye Doyle, and he runs off obsessively into these dark corners, shooting off his gun. And it's silent. There's no music. There was something very, very foreboding about that, and very frightening to me as a child. It reminded me of scary rooms that I had been in. And no one had guns or anything like that, but it was that very impressionistic thing that happens when you're a child, where you make these strange connections between something in reality and something that you see in art or in cartoons, whatever it might be. And so I always felt there was a sense of danger and frightening stuff inside of a William Friedkin film. So to me, there was a lot of nightmarishness that was happening inside of The French Connection for a young boy of around 8 years old at the time that movie was made. So for me, it really wasn't a huge leap to see William Friedkin go from doing a cop movie that seemed scary to The Exorcist. And The Exorcist being something that truly has been a major part of my life. I have friends who Jaws is a major part of their life, and Star Wars is a major part of their life. And I'm not going to say that those two movies don't have a huge area inside of me, but I don't know if there is a movie that speaks more to the nature of me than The Exorcist. It's a movie that scares me and doesn't scare me. It's a triumph for me as well as a harbinger of doom. There's so much to it, and that's because I grew up in a cult, a fundamentalist religious cult that believed that the world was going to end in 1975. So when The Exorcist came out in 73, oh my goodness, it certainly did seem like the world was coming to an end, that everything was falling apart. Even the Catholic Church, which of course my family thought was horribly vile and corrupt and a part of the devil's work, even that was having issues keeping the devil behind bars, it seemed. And so there was this thing that was in my family about possession, that this was something that could happen at any given moment. It was something that could happen for any reason, any kind of sin, any dalliance, any white lie could get you possessed by a demon, and nothing would make a demon happier than going after someone who is innocent. So The Exorcist was not only something that was kind of like, yeah, see, this is kind of proof from my family, but also kind of a misgiving about it, because it said the priests are going to take care of the problem. And also it was like super disturbing and vulgar, and my family wanted demons to just kind of go gobble, 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 I guess. Don't know. But anyway, because of my upbringing, because of my fear of everything, because of being told that everything that I questioned, but just the idea of questioning it was a sin, that this movie was going to matter to me. The book was going to matter to me. If you've listened to my podcast, you know that the book came into my life before the movie did. There was no way my family was going to let me see that film. So I read the book. And the reason I was able to read the book was that my father didn't think much of books. He was functionally illiterate, so he thought books were homework. He did not know that I brought The Exorcist into the house. But he did know that I was bringing books into the house. And he didn't really check them because he's like, yeah, what could possibly come out of a library? So I read my first sex scene in Jaws, and a lot of really violent scenes in some of the Saint books. And I think Ellery Queen. No, not Ellery Queen. He was fine. I think there were a few other hard-boiled detectives that I got to read. There was science fiction that was very sexual, and so my father had no clue, or if he did, he granted me the grace to allow me to experiment in that way, maybe assuming that the written word wasn't going to stick as much as a visual would. But anyway, one of the huge changes in my life was sitting down and reading The Exorcist and not waking up possessed the next day. So the book mattered a lot to me, and I knew the movie would if I ever got to see it, and I, of course, did. And it's still, as far as I'm concerned, a groundbreaking movie for me. And I think that it has become part of the lexicon, part of the fabric of the world, not just America. That it has changed culture in a certain way. It's certainly changed film culture. It, without a doubt, was a sea change in horror culture. And I think it still holds a lot of power in certain ways, and in other ways, perhaps not. I'm not necessarily sure that in this secular world, there's a lot of fear that comes out of The Exorcist. I also think in its pacing, it comes from a different time. And the things that Friedkin and the actors and the writers all tout about it, it's belief in realism before it becomes fantastic film, is one of its impediments, that it takes a good half hour for anything really disturbing to happen. And so it does not keep up with the change in expectations of narrative. Not short attention spans, let's stop calling it that. Narrative changes. And I bet you any money Billy would say that as well. But anyway, I digress again because this is just how this one's going to go. So, The Exorcist may not have a lot of power in a secular world, but that's kind of why The Exorcist mattered. Why The Exorcist mattered is that it was there at a time speaking about a time of anxiety and chaos for the institutions that had gone unquestioned for a long period of time. And suddenly there was questioning. And in its own way, because of the two fathers that there were to that film, William Peter Blatty and William Friedkin, we get, as we did with The French Connection, two sides of a divisive moment that can be believed or entertained by the audience. The audience can come in and feel and see what it wants to feel and see. There is latitude that is given in the narrative for you to be either a believer or a disbeliever. Or you can, in the way that I look at it, is you can be pro-anarchy against the establishment, or you can be part of the establishment. And in both ways, you are able to still be entertained by the questions of faith that are happening inside of The Exorcist. How does one talk to this without using horror? I don't think that it's possible to tell the story that The Exorcist is trying to tell, at least the story that I see being told, which doesn't have a lot to do with religion itself, but has more to do with the idea of faith as it stands. Faith in a country, faith in a culture, faith in family units, faith in religion and spirituality in and of itself, having that questioned in a way, in a world that has seen the realities of all of those things disappointing and betraying you. And that, I think, is the crux of what makes The Exorcist so good. How do you do that story without it being a total fucking downer? How do you do it without it being a polemic? How do you do it without being just a boring piece of drama? Drama is not going to be able to tell that story very well. But one thing that can, the place of allegory, the place of metaphor, is horror, the fable. So using something like demonic possession on an innocent youth to try and get to the question of faith in a priest that is failing at what he wants to do, and the loss of family and the loss of institution, all of that stuff being brought into the early 70s, where at that point in 73 we're still in Vietnam. There's still some protests that are happening, but we are already past Kent State, where college students are shot by the National Guard while protesting without any kind of weapons in their hands. All of that kind of stuff has happened, and The Exorcist hits. So now, because we're dealing with a demon, we are now able to have both sides of this party come and see something dark that is taking down everything that we feel matters, and have that be something tangible, and have it where we have empathy for that, where we know that that loss is going to be huge for us, whether or not we feel we're on that right side of it. So there's a lot in The Exorcist that I think is amazing. It is also the movie that gets past so many different versions of censorship. It's hard to believe that that movie ever got away with what it got away with. And not just the profanity and stuff, but just the level of dread that's there. But certainly it took someone like William Peter Blatty, a man of faith, to be able to write evil in such a way. It's very interesting to me. Could someone like Brian De Palma get away with that? Probably not. It would be seen as an offense. The idea of being involved in the tug of war of faith by a man of faith, there's somehow a change in how we feel about that. Or some people feel about that. The people who mattered, the people who would have been censors, the church, right? I mean, it's a great commercial for the church, let's be honest. But anyway, before we go too deep down that path, I think it's very hard to talk about The Exorcist in a fresh and original way. It's 50 years old, and it is also synonymous with possession, and everything that comes after that is beholden to it. I talk about possession movies a lot and ghost stories a lot. They're the two things that I find the scariest in narrative. They're the movies that scare me the most, even though I can be definitely scared by serial killers and stuff like that. There's something about the predatory nature of possession and ghost stories that really terrify me. And so both of them have the same positives. In other words, they're so great. They also have the same negatives. They have a chink in the armor, and that is in the last act. Both of these become unscary by the last act. Why? Well, we'll start with ghost stories because we'll end with possession because we're talking about possession films. But in ghost stories, the thing that is scary is that you have something otherworldly trying to communicate with you, and it's scaring you, and it's not necessarily apparent why this is happening. But for the most part, when you are being haunted, nobody else is aware of it. You are helpless to get any help. It somehow keeps you separated from everyone else while you are being hunted by it. So the ghost comes and terrifies you and demands to force you into certain ways of looking. It compels you to find out some secrets. It makes you beg for sanity. And to me, that's one of the scariest things that there is that a haunting will make it so that you seem insane. You seem absolutely alone in the world, in the corporeal world. You don't seem to matter anymore. You are now stuck in this world with this thing that is haunting you. And haunting and possession is reasonably close. Possession is demonic, right? So it's kind of a construct made by whoever decided that ghosts weren't enough and demons seem to be worse. Whatever that storytelling tradition comes from, and it seems to be in every culture, demons are a different form of predator. Ghosts, in a way, are asking for your help. And that is, by the way, where the last act kind of falls apart. There's nothing more terrifying than the isolation of a ghost story, except maybe a possession story, than those first couple acts where you are helpless against this thing, no one will listen to you, and it's scaring you all the time, and it is omnipresent. But once you find out that, the ghost is actually getting in touch with you because there is unreconciled stuff from their life. They're stuck in between two planes, and it usually is where they've been betrayed by somebody, or there was some murder, or money was taken, whatever it might be. You're actually being sent to do this revenge for them in some way. Avenge them because they can't do it in their form. And that isn't scary anymore. Once we get a why, ghost stories aren't scary. I call it the small claims court of horror, because essentially you are someone who unwittingly gets involved as a third party in someone else's dispute. And one part of that dispute just will not answer to the other person, is ignoring them. So they have to go to a third party to be the arbiter. And so it is like small claims court. You just, this ghost has to get you to do the work for you. And then, of course, what happens? Well, the mystery is solved. The bones are burnt. The sandwich is eaten. Whatever it is that has to be done to make this ghost able to sleep, its eternal sleep, gets done, and the movie comes to an end. So there's this whole thing of, now it's just a task-motivated deal. And this is what happens with possession films as well. There's nothing in my mind, because of my past, that's scarier than demonic possession. The idea of losing your identity, to be forced to do something that you don't want to do. Maybe even it's the darkest shadows of desire that you have will no longer have a lock on the door, and you will be doing these things. Or you will be seen as the horrible sinner that you are. But even worse is just the predatory thing of something evil inhabiting you because you fucked up. And so there's nothing scarier to me than when the pursuit is happening. the thing where people are in their house and stuff just moves. They're in bed and the bed shakes. All of a sudden they wake up out of sleepwalking in the middle of the street. Whatever it might be, the shadows are coming off the wall. They're hearing disembodied voices. They're hearing laughter in the bathroom. The doors are closing. They're pushed downstairs. All of those things you are prey. You are no longer at the top of the food chain. And that's what has always been frightening to me about the possession film. But, starting with The Exorcist, we have the final act, which is once you find out that the person's possessed, well, it's just like having a social disease, isn't it? You find out, oh my goodness, you got demons. And what do? Back in the day of 1973, doctors made house calls. But instead of doctors, we basically have two priests who are coming in, and you got yourself a bad case. It's like it's a doctor's visit. It is a supernatural doctor's visit where they're going to give you a shot of penicillin and the clap's going to go away. And it's going to be a couple hosannas and a power of Christ that compels you. And all of the mystery that there is in a possession film of demons and death and doom and destruction, this story shrinks to the size of a bedroom, or a barn, or a chair, or a bed. Whatever it is, it ends up with someone tied down and people praying over them and screaming. And it doesn't matter what the variation is, it ends up there. And everything shrinks down into melodrama in that final act. And that is, the testament of the power of the first original story done by William Peter Blatty, that he created a template that is impossible seemingly to shake. It's exceedingly rare that you see any kind of variation on that theme. And usually if it is a variation on the theme, they go there first and then subvert it by having the person break away from the chair or whatever it might be. But the thing that's really interesting is that is something that has so much influence. It's a story that has so much influence that we don't even recognize its influence, right? It's like the celebration of the first wheel while you're driving around in radial tires. Its reach and its change on culture is so huge that it is almost impossible to see it. It's the forest for the trees kind of thing. It's so pervasive that it even seems to hit in reality. Who would have ever thought that William Friedkin and William Peter Blatty would have got reality right the first time it gets on film, right? The Exorcist, we know exactly how the devil sounds coming out of somebody. We know what possession looks like. All of that stuff. And it really hit me when I saw The Devil and Father Amorth, which is I call it a pseudo-documentary that William Friedkin made several years ago, where he went to see The Exorcist for the Pope, the Vatican exorcist. And he went to see these exorcisms, and the way that exorcisms are dealt with in Italy, it is kind of like having a cold. It is kind of like having the clap. It seems everybody gets either abducted by the mob at some point, or they get a possession. And so Father Amorth goes there and he thumbs his nose and everything. But once the possession starts, once the exorcism starts, oh my goodness, you hear that gravelly voice. It's as if the movie is playing in the background. So what is real and what is fake? And what is the idea of something that is so embedded in culture that it becomes the reality? Who knows? But that is some of the power of The Exorcist. And yet, why do horror fans kind of bristle at times when they talk about The Exorcist? Why, in the death of William Friedkin, have we not just seen huge outpourings, days long, from horror fans? Well, it's because he said some disparaging things about horror many times through his career. And made The Exorcist an exception from horror. And I've spoken often about this in my podcast, in my book, about how if you change the genre every time that there's an exceptional horror film, then there are no exceptional horror films. If it starts as a horror film, but once there's a couple Oscars involved, it suddenly becomes a psychological thriller or a supernatural thriller or a twisted fairy tale or a Grimm's fairy tale. If you call it all of those things, well, what you're doing is you're making sure that horror can never be exceptional. And that means that there is a genre that means nothing. And that is something that should be resented. Now, with that said, Friedkin on many occasions changed his mind about that. He went back and forth about whether it was a horror film or not. And in the end, towards the end of his life, only a few weeks ago, I guess, he was a guest on Turner Classic Movies. And someone who had read enough about William Friedkin in interviews said, I know that The Exorcist isn't a horror film. And Friedkin said, of course it is. Yes, it's a horror film. Once again, a wonderful contrarian, Billy to the end. But I don't think it was an act. I think that Billy Friedkin was always somewhat conflicted in certain things. But I think he just thoroughly believed what he believed at any given moment. And he was someone who could argue a point. He kind of, I can be this way too, which is a natural arguer. If you come at me with something and you're trying to absolutely tell me this is perfectly legitimate and this is the only way things can be, I'm going to argue with you. It's how I got heard as a kid. And I think, he was a only child as well. So who knows? Perhaps that has something to do with it. But there are things that I think are really interesting about him. And I have to say, there are many stories that I could go down. There are many videos that I've watched over the last couple weeks, interviews with him, Q&As from different film festivals, things that he did in other countries that were master classes about filmmaking, things that he said. I could go down a whole bunch of them, but I don't want to get too bogged down in it. What I do want to do is give a little bit of an idea of some personal experience around him from friends of mine who dealt with him, but also how much even people who disagreed with him could not wait to hear him. He was a great raconteur. He was someone who live could just charm the pants off of you, still get crazy, still get volatile, and yet you were listening to every word that he had to say. I will say that William Friedkin is another in a long line of complicated artists that I tend to like. It's rough being me sometimes, folks, because I don't have too many people who I absolutely adore the work that they do, where there isn't time where you have to argue or debate around that person's validity or whether or not they're worth talking about. They tend to bring rancor out in people. People like Harlan Ellison, Sam Peckinpah. William Friedkin is certainly of that ilk. I would say that Alfred Hitchcock does the same. Brian De Palma, another person who, depending upon who you're speaking to, they can have some strong opinions about these guys. All of them, I think, have another thing that's in common, which is they are bright stars in what they do. They make exceptional films, and exceptional being that they are not of the ordinary. There is something about them that makes it memorable in a fashion that normally you just don't see. Anyway, a hard guy to love at times if you're not part of his inner circle, I guess. I have a story that I want to put out there that comes from a friend who was involved in a film festival back in 2012. Before I go into this story about what happened in the Belgian International Fantastic Film Festival and back in 2012, I want to talk about how consistent William Friedkin was in his being difficult. And what I mean by that is he was difficult before he was famous. He was difficult before he had success. He had caused himself to get shot in the foot on his career several times before he had The French Connection. He had, I think, 4 or 5 films before, and one of them being a documentary, People vs. Paul Crump, that in that time period of working on these films, he burnt bridges. And someone came to his rescue at the right time. The thing that's consistent is that he didn't do it to be an asshole per se. It's that he could not compel himself to say something in a certain way that would be more polite. He gave what he thought. He did that to Blake Edwards when Blake Edwards had him come in to take a look at the Peter Gunn movie script that was there, which ironically enough was, or coincidentally, I guess, not ironically, coincidentally enough was written by William Peter Blatty, but didn't have Blatty's name on it because Blake Edwards used to put his name on things that other people did. But because of him going in and telling Blake Edwards that it was a piece of shit, that your worst enemy wouldn't write a script for you to produce like that, and getting fired before he even got the job, made him impress William Peter Blatty to a point that William Peter Blatty knew that he could trust him to tell him exactly what he thought, and he wanted to work with him later, and of course that gets him to The Exorcist. And he had done this a few other times where he had worked on a film, and I think it was the night they raided MINSKY'S, and before the movie came out, and he was out working on, I think, the birthday party. He was doing a British interview, and in that interview he said, "That's a terrible movie," before it even came out. And so he rat-fucked the producers who were insensate over him doing that. And so he burnt bridges there. This is all happening before there's even a thought that he might be nominated for something. So it's not like he became big and then started throwing his weight around. He was throwing his weight around when he didn't have any weight. Now, did it get worse? I'm sure it did. Ask anybody who worked with him on Sorcerer. That wasn't in front of the camera. Yes, he may have lost his mind over the celebrity that came with the 1-2 punch of The Exorcist and The French Connection. But anyway, a friend of mine, I'm going to read what he had to say because I don't want to paraphrase in a way when I know that there's something here. Now, the person who's involved with this is named Dr. AC. That's his online persona. He also has a book called Horror 101 and Hidden Horror. These are great books, and he is a true believer in horror. He's also just a cineast. He's a lot like me. It's not just horror films, but horror films are the be-all, end-all, but we watch all sorts of films. So I have a lot of respect for Dr. AC, and his opinion goes a long way with me. So this is him working behind the scenes for the Brussels International Fantasy Film Festival in 2012, which I believe was their 30th anniversary. At the same time as they had William Friedkin there, they also had Terry Gilliam and a few other luminaries there at this festival. And they were going to be showing Tracy Letts' white trash play Killer Joe as it was adapted into a film by William Friedkin. So without further ado, let me take a few moments to be able to read what Dr. AC said, with a caveat that he says, I was a younger and angrier man at that time. So you can keep that in mind. But here we go. He says that I've known the name of director William Friedkin for a long time now, and while he hasn't always hit the bullseye, he'll go down in the history books thanks to the 1-2 punch of The French Connection and The Exorcist. All this I say to preface the fact that when I saw Mr. Friedkin's name, here's a special 2012 BIFFF guest, on the interview potentials, my heartbeat picked up a bit. Even though, by all accounts, he is a difficult person to work with, even before he had any legitimate success, there was no denying my excitement over meeting one of the creative minds behind this seminal, influential, and deeply personal film. Couple this with the fact that he was promoting his latest effort, a screen version of Tracy Letts' incredible white trash play Killer Joe, which I had seen in its 1992 world premiere in Chicago at Next Theater. My viewing of the play, which starred a then 18-year-old Michael Shannon alongside one of my favorite undersung talents, Paul Dillon, in the title role, likewise burned itself into my brain. So, here we have the director of one of my all-time favorite films directing the screen adaptation of one of my top 5 theatrical experiences. You can see why I might be a little excited about chatting with this guy. Then I start hearing the myriad stories and conditions and stipulations and misery that he has caused amongst the BIFFF personnel. How he refuses to do personal interviews like everyone else, such as Terry Gilliam, arguably a more talented visionary. How he won't do a Q&A following the Killer Joe screening because he doesn't want to compete for attention between himself and the 10 p.m. feature that follows. How he will not take photos of the public nor sign autographs. How he doesn't want to talk about The Exorcist at a fantastic film festival. Add in a wealth of other unpleasantries that I can't really go into public forum as they were revealed to me in confidence by press team members. Bottom line, this guy sounds like an enormous prick, or maybe an individual compensating for an extremely small one. Am I still going to meet with him? Of course. Am I prepared to be disappointed? Of course. The morning's press conference rolls around, and again we are warned not to talk about The Exorcist, not to ask him to take fanboy photos or sign autographs. Our hearts and tender egos now steeled against this ogre's onslaught, we assemble in the near-empty Tour et Taxi pavilion at 10 a.m., a time chosen, we assume, in order that he should not have to deal with the unruly rabble, and we wait. Friedkin appears right on time, and to make a long story short, proceeds to chat openly and freely about every aspect of his career, including the film which must not be named, in the most congenial fashion imaginable. Sitting in the front row as I am, we often make eye contact and share actual banter, bonding over a Chicago connection, because he was born there, etc. He's talking about not only his CV, but films and artwork that inspired all of us assembled. Far from the monster we've been hearing about, the experience is not unlike Billy Friedkin hanging out with a group of newfound friends. Whereas we thought we would have him for maybe an hour, he gabs for nearly 3 hours, never giving the impression of wanting to wrap things up or cut things short. From a film fan's perspective, it's about as great an encounter as could be imagined. But again, this is all a matter of perspective, because the asshole that is William Friedkin tellingly reveals itself towards the end of the session. One of the journalists asked why he had elected not to have a Q&A following Killer Joe, and Billy Boy came unglued. He spoke about how he wanted to talk to all the people in the 1,000-plus theater, as opposed to talking to a few select people who decided to stop by the Q&A area, a practice that was good enough for Terry Gilliam, Barbara Steele, etc., mind you. He thought it unfair to the other screening that followed that he would be talking out in the pavilion area while their movie was screening. Not wanting to be a quote-unquote distraction, a comment which only pointed up the fact that he had not seen any of the festival offerings, since if he had, he would have known you cannot hear any incidental noise from the Commons area. He out and out called the Belgian Film Festival staff liars for spreading the rumor that he didn't want to meet with his public, something which no one had said. Yes, the guest of the festival was calling his hosts, who had brought him here, honored him, housed him, babied him, and bent over backwards to accommodate his many demands, liars, in front of the press. Then he has all the gall to say that, he wanted to have a Q&A, but it needed to be somewhere off-site that he could accommodate many people, not just a select few. This couldn't have been suggested earlier, say in private. No, he does it in a last-minute public forum to shame his hosts, putting them in a situation where they are forced to acquiesce to his desires. Jonathan, the unflappable head of the BIFFF press department, proceeds to take the stage with Friedkin and calmly states that they can arrange a Q&A session at the restaurant next door following the screening, something which he then had to clear with said restaurant, I was later informed. This was a decision which of course then necessitated the production of last-minute flyers and notices to promote the impromptu event. I sat there shaking my head, watching an 800-pound gorilla throw his weight around, and my stomach soured a bit. Whew. End of story. There was in fact an off-site Q&A, and apparently he was congenial and generous, even agreeing to signing autographs and posing for pictures. Nicely done, good sir. You look like the good guy, and the BIFF looks like the bad guy that you wanted to give the adoring fans what they wanted. I'm glad I had my conversation with Friedkin, but there's no doubt about it. This guy's a certified grade A bona fide asshole, and I'm not one who uses such terms lightly. How much does a little graciousness cost? Nothing, that's how much. Love some of your movies, Billy, but fuck you very much. And there you go, from the trenches. Now, I bring that up because I'm also going to give counterpoints of places where, in his career, Billy Friedkin went out of his way to promote other artists and to remember who was there for him early on in his career, and his dedication and loyalty to people at his own possible expense of his career came to the forefront. You know, in all of the movies that he was doing early on, specifically when he's dealing with the French Connection, which at certain points, the people who were making it, D'Antonio, I'm forgetting his first name, but the first producer ended up losing the rights to the book because things were taking so long, and he stuck out with that guy and came up with an agreement between him and the new producer. There were many things that had happened where he had to acquiesce, but not only that, very little compromise can be said, but he also admits many times when he is a fool. It's very interesting in the very beginning of his book, The Friedkin Connection, where he talks about all the things, allegedly, because he's a guy who deals with his instinct and his gut, and he tells you follow instinct and gut, how many times that didn't work for him. How he could have been part of the Basquiat phenomenon. He was given some watercolors by Basquiat early on. He could have been part of the Prince empire when Prince sent him Little Red Corvette and wanted to see if he wanted to do a music video with him and all of this stuff. And knowing how Prince rewards people who work with him, it could have been a whole different story. He was asked to be one of the producers on Star Wars. He was asked to be one of the original owners, or the new owners, that is, of the Boston Celtics. The list goes on and on of things that he said no to that could have made him great. So if his instincts were so infallible, he should have had a great career and rich beyond his possible needs anytime, multiple times over. His name and his star would have never diminished. But he also talks about how in the middle of doing all of these things, all these movies, from Good Times, where he was working with Sonny and Cher, how he followed what he thought was right and it bit him in the ass. And how sometimes his own self-promotion got in the way. With Good Times, they wanted to make a movie that was mocking stardom and mocking the idea of needing to be popular, realizing that they had made a movie that was all about them actually trying to be popular. It's interesting observations like that tell me that this isn't just an egotist, although certainly an egotist. This is someone who also can be somewhat balanced in how he looks at himself. There are many times in the several interviews that I watched over the last several weeks where he shows moments of both. Friedkin was certainly unflappable and willing to put people in their place, something that he had in common with another of my heroes, Harlan Ellison. There's an early interview with Mick Garris from the Fantasy Film Festival, and it was right around when The Exorcist came out. And Mick Garris is talking about the difference between the book and the movie. And Mick Garris says, well, it's been said that the movie goes for more of the exploitative elements of the book and leaves some of the more spiritual things in there. And Friedkin goes, yeah, who said that? And Mick Garris like, he had no answer. And it was obvious he didn't know, and he was just paraphrasing, or maybe it wasn't even there. But Friedkin's like, I never heard that. That's never been said in front of me. And then he continues on the conversation, but he would stop people if they were trying to play little games with him. And I always thought that was kind of cool, because I do think that, people who are in genre get pissed on a lot. That's what I loved about Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison was in science fiction, right? Science fiction, fantasy, and dark stories, dark fantasy, I think he called it, which was a thorn in my side. He never really liked to use the term horror, even though he worked in that. So, anyway, back to it, is that because you had people like Asimov and Bradbury, everybody thought that science fiction guys were just these bookish nerds that were somewhat spineless and just lived in these little dark corners. And then you had Harlan Ellison come out and say, I'm going to fuck all of the women. I'm going to do all of these things. I'm going to write scripts, and I'm going to be able to fight you. If you want to come at me and you want to try and think you can take me down, bullshit. And if you come to me with any form of superiority, I am smarter than you. I will out-talk you. I will out-think you. Fuck you. And that was so refreshing for anybody who felt as if they were supposed to be under somebody's thumb because of what they liked, because of what they thought was interesting art. Of course, William Friedkin made several different films in many different styles. But I will say that if you really push comes to shove, he's someone who worked in genre films. He worked in action films, adventure films. He worked in police procedurals, and he worked in horror. And in all of those, he tried to bring them up above the expectations. And in many of those cases, his obsessiveness made for headlines. The idea of the French Connection's chase, of course, is something that gets brought up a lot. I think he says it's 26 blocks at 90 miles an hour. And when he's asked if whether he feared for people's lives, he said it never even dawned on him at that moment. That level of obsessiveness. The idea that he wasn't actually doing daring do, but that this was just how you got things done. The idea of slapping actors and shooting off guns, fake guns, of course, on the set to get people to freak out. The idea of actually getting real counterfeiters in to live or die in L.A. to ply their trade and then have the goddamn money get out into the real circulation, to not actually guard that with your fucking life, instead having it go out there. Oh my God, can you have something more interesting and controversial and something to get people to want to go see the movie even more than when people were declaring the car chase in To Live or Die in L.A. as the little French Connection, which I don't know, is that actually a compliment or not? I'm not necessarily sure. But in his films, there were always these moments where the rubbing up against two different types of people tended to, that friction made for interesting filmmaking. And you see it in some of the choices that he made early on, which failed him in The French Connection, where he wanted to have Jimmy Breslin play Eddie Egan, or Popeye Doyle, that is, and having Eddie Egan furious over that because Jimmy Breslin was anti-cop. So he wanted to have an anti-cop play a cop in a movie that is showing moral ambiguity about the police and yet still have the police happy with you. In fact, the only reason that your movie's getting made and breaking all kinds of rules, like creating traffic jams where on a bridge when you have no permits whatsoever, by basically befriending all of the off-duty policemen to put their cars up in the road. Oh my goodness, playing both sides of that. And then I think that kind of combat that's between two different ideas shows up in these movies often. I do think that one of the reasons that The Exorcist works so well, and I'm with Mark Kermode, who does the BBC films. He did Fear of God, I think it was called, 25 Years of The Exorcist, 25 years ago. And Mark and I agree on one thing, certainly, which then Friedkin debunks. But back in the day, when you did research on William Friedkin and The Exorcist, it was very obvious that you had someone who was a true believer, an ex-Jesuit priest who wrote it, and someone who was a skeptic non-believer, someone who at that point would be more akin to calling himself an agnostic than anything else. And that constant battle between these two fathers created a movie that just sang with that conflict and made it seem so real. I think that happens a lot in Friedkin's films. But of course, later on, Friedkin changes whether he's religious or spiritual many, many times. And it can get exhausting when you are someone who does research, then to find out that the research changes depending upon which interview you decide to watch or read or listen to. I kind of really have a soft spot for Mark Maron's WTF podcast interview that went, I think, 2.5 hours with William Friedkin about 6 years ago. And I believe this was, well, obviously it was after Killer Joe and everything. He had done Father Amorth, and he wasn't doing a lot of interviews anymore, but he decided to come on Mark Maron's show because he had heard his show and he felt that he would be kept on his toes. He admitted that many times when he's doing interviews that he would just kind of phone it in, that he would no longer be really listening. Everyone asks the same questions. He is always on autopilot. And instead, Mark Maron came at him with some interesting things. He said about Sorcerer, which he absolutely loves. He goes, "Did you lose your mind while you were doing Sorcerer?" And then it just went out of control and out of budget and everything. And he goes, "Well, that is one way to say it, I guess. Yes." And they had a good laugh over that. But what I think is interesting is that you get an idea of some of the things that after all of this time, synthesized itself in the culmination, the sitting back and looking at a career that William Friedkin was doing at that time. He had a saying that he had said many times, and it was around the successes of things like The Exorcist, where people would come out of the woodwork to say that they did a writing piece on this, and they came up with the idea for that, and the only reason that this car chase happened was because of this, and the only reason that Sorcerer was able to get done was because of that, and always these people are taking some form of credit, and William Friedkin often said that success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. And he had another saying, which I believe he had in his book, and I think that it is a fitting place to look at the career of William Friedkin and a life crazily lived. And that quote is, "Life is lived forward, but can only be understood backward." So only at the end, when there's a level of resignation, do we start hearing what I think is a summation of all the craziness. That kind of feels a little bit like modesty. When I watched the Turner Classic Movie interview, which is only, I think, a couple months old, where he's being interviewed about The Exorcist's 50th coming up. He's very gracious about what his legacy is. And he finally comes out and says that The Exorcist is a horror film, which matters to me. But what really hits me is it's the first time that I see Billy Friedkin looking frail. He's never looked like a really tough guy, you know. He looked like an angry guy. He looked like somebody who could cut you apart with words. But he always looked healthy and hale, down to Friedkin Uncut, the documentary that came out a few years ago. Happy, healthy, drinking a lot of coffee, calling people off screen motherfuckers, all that stuff, very vivacious. But when I saw him in that interview on Turner Classic Movies, he looked very frail. He had that look in his hands. Hands don't lie. Ears don't lie. Eyes don't lie. Overnight, you go from looking old to frail. And he had that look. He had one of his fingers was in a brace, like he had broken it or stubbed it or cut it, whatever it might have been. The kind of things that happen as you get older and your skin starts to become almost like onion skin paper. And he came out. And he was very, very sweet to the audience. And he talked about cinema and the things that he absolutely loved. And I felt that same kind of thing, even though it was 6 years earlier from the Mark Maron interview, where he talked about different times in his career, how he felt about these things, the crazy things that he needed to do, and how much he wouldn't do those things now. Not just you couldn't get away with it, but now he realizes that some of these things might have been nuts. Now, all that is a little bit easy to say when you're on the other side of a couple Oscars about these films, but at the same point, it is still something that is being said, an understanding of some of the madness that he did. There was always daring duo. There's a reason he was called Hurricane Billy. He left a lot of really exciting stories in his wake. It's also kind of hard to say what exactly William Friedkin felt his legacy was going to be. But I think he really gets at what I believe to be the final point of a life pretty well lived and crazily lived when he's dealing with Mark Maron, and he says, no one's going to remember these movies. He goes, in fact, if it wasn't for home video, many of the movies that we absolutely love would have been lost already. And Mark Maron goes, are you okay with that? He goes, yes, things change. He goes, yeah, but change can be bad. He goes, no, things just change. That's what happens in the world. Ideas change. Cultures change. Mores change. All of that changes, and I've had my moment. And it's interesting because it's something that was said in his book as well. He was being interviewed in a restaurant for maybe another book. I'm not necessarily sure who it was that he was talking to, but he says he's talking about all of these films that he absolutely loved and the artists that he grew up with. And these two teenage girls or 20-something girls come up and say, listen, we heard your conversation. We can't help but come over and say that we absolutely love movies. But you're talking about movies like they have this level of importance. We just go to have fun. We go to make sure that we feel as if life is entertaining and enjoyable. And so William Friedkin turns to him and goes, that's interesting. So can I ask you about a few directors? Do you know who... and we'll just say it was Otto Preminger is? No. Do you know who Alfred Hitchcock is? Not necessarily sure. The name sounds familiar. Says, how about Orson Welles? Oh, yes, we know Orson Welles. He did that Rosebud movie. What do you remember about that? He goes, well, I think it was a sled. And that's what they remembered. And he asks a few more movies that mean so much to cineasts, people that if you go to film school, you're being taught to watch these movies. And he's asking these people about these different directors and these different movies, and they don't know any of them. And then he goes, have you ever seen The Exorcist? And they go, oh, yes, absolutely. He goes, really? Goes, now, is that a movie that made you feel good about life and entertained you? Oh, absolutely, yes. May I ask why? Because now we know the devil's real. And he said, well, in his mind, he said, that's not what I made it for, but you know what? That's probably how it'll be remembered. And so he realized that we are here for a short period of time. What we leave behind matters, but what people actually think of it doesn't really matter that much. It's not in your hands anymore. You can be a hurricane, or you can just go gracefully through the world. But be seen. And with that, I say goodnight to Hurricane Billy. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.